Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 1 of Hume 188G and our first lecture to get us started in the course. So, as I mentioned, I'm putting our lectures into GoReact to make them more interactive, and at the end of every lecture, you will be able to fill out a survey and tell me what's working, what's not working. Feel free to compliment me as well as critique the lectures, but it will also take a few weeks to get used to this. So everybody's being patient with everybody, and hopefully my goal is for these to be really interesting and engaging and useful for your learning. So for the first week, we are just going to be introducing you to the course Communication, Culture, and Sport. So first, we'll do just that, the course topic introduction and the overview of the semester outline, and then we'll take a break. And by that, I mean we're pausing the video. You're going to pause the video, and then the second part of the lecture, we'll be talking about COVID-19 and sports culture. So first, a note about lecture participation using GoReact. As I already just mentioned, it's going to take a little bit to get used to, and there are a lot of you in the course. So the comment stream might look overwhelming at first, and what I will say is that if you just make the video full screen and then X out of full screen whenever I want you to add a comment, that will help keep you focused. If you're keeping the small video screen on the left and then the comment stream on the right, it's just going to look ridiculous. And I mean, I even will be able to filter through, select each student and see only your comments so that I'm not seeing everybody's, because there will be a lot. And also, you will see screens with a pause symbol on them, and that is indicating that I want you to answer the question that's on the screen. And in terms of evaluation, it is kind of like a checkbox system. So I want you to respond to all of the prompts, and I want you to ask a question or comment on a peer's response, etc. And all of those guidelines are laid out in the assignment description. But again, my biggest pro tip is to leave the video in full screen so that you're not distracted by the comment stream. So this course is called Communication, Culture, and Sport. Over the next couple weeks, we'll be breaking down these 3 concepts in more detail. I do want to give an overview of them, so if you're deciding whether or not you want to stay enrolled in the class, you at least can make an informed decision about that, but also to get you excited about what's to come. So let's start with communication. Now, you're not in a COM course, right? The course code for this is Hume. It's a Hume 188 and it's a G. So this is a core course. And the reason it's about communication is because, well, I'm a communication professor and scholar, and I spent over a decade studying and teaching communication. So what does this mean? So before we get to this definition, when you think of communication, you're probably thinking about the public speaking class that you've taken or are avoiding taking here at LR. And that certainly is our very foundational communication course. But communication is so much more than that. So much more than that. If you study comm here, we've got broadcast, media, storytelling, any kind of aspect of verbal, digital, written communication. And ultimately, and this is where I'll bring the definition up, communication is a transactional process in which people generate meaning through the exchange of verbal and nonverbal messages in specific contexts, influenced by individual and societal forces, and embedded in culture. So communication isn't just giving a public speech. or having a conversation with a friend or a family member. That all of that is communication. But communication is also broader than that. It's the meaning that's created both explicitly and implicitly. So as students studying this topic from the perspective of communication, what you'll be looking for is meaning. You'll be looking for, what does this case study or this event or this advertisement communicate? What is it saying? And in particular, what is it saying about culture? What is it saying about identity? What is it saying about sports? So again, we're going to get into a few more details with that in the next couple weeks, but generally speaking, we're looking at meaning making. And this is just a word bubble, a word cloud with different ways of thinking about communication. So yes, words, language, information, comprehension, but ideas and symbols and forms and processes. So next we're going to get into culture. And again, this is just a preview. We're going to have much more to read about this and more detailed lectures about this in the next couple weeks. But this is really how I'm approaching the study of culture, or what we would think of as cultural studies. So these are elements of culture. And when you think of that word, you might have some definition in mind, like norms, behaviors. A lot of times when folks think of culture, they're thinking about race, identity, ethnicity, place of birth. And that is all part of culture for sure. But as you can see from this graphic, it's much more than what your skin color is or where you're from or any of that kind of literal stuff. When we're thinking about culture, we have attitudes, beliefs, which are deeply held. We've got language. Every culture has its own idiosyncratic languages, whether that's literally Portuguese versus English versus German. But also, as you know, as students in America, I can't say that all of you are American citizens. I don't know that. But if you're an American citizen, you know that different regions have different dialects and different ways of speaking. And then we also think about different kinds of English that are not just dialects or accents, but are actually just different variations of English. So you can imagine that any other language out there also has equal variation, and we could do a whole course just on that. We've got customs. So these are habits, these are traditions. Rituals are similar to that. I mean, rituals can be something like holidays, or in the sports context, tailgating, any post-game rituals. If you are an athlete or if you are a fan, these are the things that we habitually do. So behavior, faith, religion, food, art, drama, music, and the cycle continues. So these are all of the elements of culture that we will be discussing as they relate to the world of sports. So again, I just want to emphasize that culture is not just race, ethnicity, skin color, or nationality, place of birth. It's those things, but much deeper than that. We're thinking about how our attitudes are formed based on maybe our racial or ethnic identity, or how our attitudes are shaped by where we live. And then finally, sport. So the title of this course, and pretty much every lecture that we will be going through this semester, I intentionally use the word sport and not sports. And that is something that, we don't need to get into the weeds about it, but it is intentional. So I want to just talk a little bit about that. So first, there is this 4-part typology or like categorization of sports. At the base level, we have play. So this is what you learn how to do as a baby human, right? Just physical or intellectual activity pursued for its own sake. So you're just playing. And in a sports or athletic setting, this is, equivalent to playing catch with your brother or sister or mom or dad. You are just out there having fun. You want to move your body, and it is just an enjoyable, pleasurable experience. And there's no motivation behind it other than that. Games are organized play. So if you are playing catch in the backyard and you just make a game out of it, and game theory is this whole other thing, and we could get way too deep into the weeds there, but essentially you're just organizing your play. So play really is just free flowing. You're just tossing things around, you're rolling around on the ground. I don't know, you're just playing, you're having fun, right? And I always just associate this with like childlike play. And then games become more organized, and we learn how to play games when we're young as well, whether they are sports or athletic games or puzzles or Duck Duck Goose, right? Whatever it is, we have an organization to that play. Contests have winners and losers. So these are games that are competitive, and we have winners and we have losers. But what makes sports are that they have a physical component. So sports are the physical manifestation of play, games, and contests. And there is a lot of debate about what counts as sports, and I believe it was last spring in my class we had a pretty heated debate about esports, and the folks, and there are really good points on both sides of that debate, and we're not here to debate that. So we're not going to worry about what counts or what doesn't count, because that's not really relevant to what I want you to get from the course. But this is essentially how we lay it out, just to give you some sort of parameters around what it is we're talking about. So we're likely not going to talk about chess. We're not going to talk about the point and shoot video games, probably. So are they a sport? That's not important, right? But we are just going to focus on the organized, competitive play that has a physical component. So another way of saying this is playful physical contests. And so the reason for the sport versus sports, it's kind of like a proper noun if you want to think about it that way. So when we refer to specific contests such as basketball or golf, that's the general catch-all sports. But when we're thinking about this institutional or cultural arrangement of leagues, teams, officials, players, fans, media, event, spectacle, behaviors, traditions, that's like our all-encompassing proper noun, sport. And as we go through the class, you'll see why that makes sense when it's paired with the word culture, right? So individual sports have their own culture, but there's also a culture of sport. So I kind of mentioned this, but this class is not about, well, I guess I didn't, but this class is not about scores, statistics, or other sports talk. I mentioned the debate about esports or even fantasy sports. We're not going to preoccupy ourselves with what counts as sport and what doesn't count. We're not going to talk about scores or statistics or who the greatest of all time is, we will talk about important events and great sports moments and great athletes, but ultimately the focus is on that graphic that I showed earlier with, we're looking at the language of sport, the traditions, the behaviors, the attitudes that are manifest in sport and around sport. So it's a bigger picture, and we're not preoccupying ourselves with the super granular things like scores, statistics, Hall of Fame, all of that. So that is communication, culture, and sport. So the next couple weeks, we will continue to have our foundational material to really understand what our site of investigation is. So how do we identify communication? How do we identify culture? How do we identify sport? And how do we explore the intersections of those three things? So how is this class different from other classes, quote unquote, about sports? So it really is about perspective. So you are here in a core course, a humanities course. You can take a sports class in HSB, right? Society and behavior. You could probably take a sports class in, and it might not be part of the core, but I mean, if you're taking a kinesiology or an exercise physiology course, that's certainly about sports, but it's not a humanities perspective. So we are contrasting these perspectives with humanities. So the things on the screen now are not humanities, or at least not like explicitly considered humanities. So a sociology class about sports, sports psychology, sports marketing, sports economics, coaching, management, even the media focus in the program of communication here, those are not humanities courses. They are social sciences. So what the heck does humanities mean? So on the screen now, I put this graphic up here again because culture is a really big part about what the humanities mean. And the word human is in humanities, but human in the context of meaning making. And we're thinking about historical aspects and larger contextual considerations. And what I mean by that is anytime we're looking at some sort of artifact or event or sport or athlete, we're not just looking at that one thing. We're looking at that one thing in the context of all of these other things and how they intersect and affect and impact one another. So a history class is certainly humanities. So I don't know if there are any courses here on sports history, but that would be a humanities class. Any kind of political science, diplomacy, globalization, these are topics we'll be covering in this class, as well as identity, audience, and with that, rhetoric, language, and symbols. So my PhD is actually in rhetoric. So I'm a humanist, I'm a humanities scholar, and I am a rhetorician, which is one who studies rhetoric. So we're going to be talking about rhetoric and what exactly that word means. And trust me, I still don't really know what it means. I mean, I do. I have a PhD in it. But my point is, it's not a simple concept. It's very complex, and we're not going to get too into the weeds with it, but I want you to have a general understanding of what that means so that whenever you use the word rhetoric, you know what you're referring to. We're taking a critical perspective. There are some universities out there who offer degrees in cultural studies, and that would be a humanities program. And we're thinking about the human and the natural worlds and things. So objects, artifacts, and there is a movement in the humanities, essentially called the post-humanities, which doesn't mean we are not thinking about humans, but we're thinking about humans as they relate to the human and the natural world, objects, things, places, spaces. So one of the outcomes of this course as a global learning course is that you will understand the relationship between culture and yourself and the environment that you are in the natural world, and how all of those things impact one another. So here's your first pause, and we're 20 minutes in, and I probably should have put a pause in earlier than this, but next time I'll do better. So reflect on the different perspectives to study sport, as well as your previous experiences. Academic, athletic, personal. What are you familiar with? So I'm referring to all of the perspectives on these two slides, whether it's the sociological perspective. So if you've taken a marketing class or a media class, that's what I want you to type in the chat. Or if you've taken a sports history class or no sports history, I want you to type that in the chat. So when you pause this video, just go back to these slides, and that's what I'm asking you to reflect on. What perspectives are you familiar with? What experiences do you have in this topic area? And then, what personal or athletic experiences have you had? All right, so now that you've gotten that prompt out in the chat, I want to preview the way the course is going to be organized. And the caveat here is that we might, there's always room for adjustments based on things that are happening. If a lot of you all are ill at one point, and I really hope that's not the case, but my point is that it can be flexible. We can adjust things. If I feel like you have not grasped one of these topics well enough, we might spend some extra time on it, but this is generally speaking what we'll be covering, and week by week. And notice on here, you don't see any specific readings or activities. That's because you'll find all of that in each module, but the graphic on the left is infused into the schedule on the right. So when we get to like sports metaphors and embedded ideology, that's going to be a lot of the rhetoric stuff as well as spectacle. But anyway, this is the breakdown. So the next question is, which of the 9 elements of culture from that graphic or schedule are you most interested in exploring this semester? So again, go back to this slide, and out of all of these different elements or the specific topics in the schedule, what are you most interested in? All right, great. So before we take our break, this is your time to type in the chat, what questions do you have about the topic of this course? So if you have questions about the expectations or the assignments or any of the syllabus kind of stuff, put those questions here, but also questions about what the topic is. Because again, if you're still deciding whether or not you want to be in this class, it's good to ask those questions. All right, now it is time to take a break. So feel free to just pause this video and come back to it after you've taken a little bit of a stretch break, gotten yourself some water to drink, and we will resume. Welcome back. In this second part of the lecture, we will be talking about COVID-19 and sports culture. The reason we're opening up with COVID-19, you're probably really sick of hearing about it at this point and talking about it at this point, and I totally understand. I'm with you all. I just want it to be over. I want to go back to the way it was. I think we have to remember that things will always be different from here on out. And that's not the point here, but I'm with you. I'm tired of it. But this is a good topic to open with because the pandemic and the cancellations of sporting events and all of the different adjustments that have been made to schedules, that really reveals a lot about sports culture. And so this is kind of our opening case study. So some notes about this. I mean, we're living through it right now. So I don't want to talk about COVID-19 as if it's something that's in the past, because it's not. We're currently living through it. But one thing that I want you all to keep in mind is that this is not the first time that sports have been disrupted. So on the screen here, you're seeing a list of different years, no specific dates on this list, but different years where there was some sort of disruption to the World Series or March Madness or whatever it is. March Madness is kind of like a recent phenomenon, but you get the picture. So in 1918, 1941 through 45, we have war. I mean, a lot of athletes were soldiers. So we had to put a pause on a lot of the sports then. And if you're familiar with A League of Their Own, I love that movie. But when the women play baseball while the men are at war. Anyway, 1963 and 1968, we have assassinations. So here's a bonus question. Without Googling it, do you know who the 3 people were that were assassinated? 1 was in 1963 and 2 were in 1968. So that's your bonus question. And again, so 3 people were assassinated and there were disruptions to the sports schedule. In 1972, we have what is known as the Munich Massacre. So this was a really sad event. In 1972, the Olympics were in Munich, right? So 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were killed during the Olympic Games by Palestinian terrorists. The games and the competition continued after a suspension of a day and a half. Jim McKay anchored the coverage on ABC. He famously said of the kidnapped athletes, "They're all gone." So, America, sorry, I'm getting a little past that. I went to the Moscow one. So back to the Munich Massacre, they just suspended it for a day and a half. And then in Moscow, we have the Olympics boycott, which was where America did not participate because the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. So NBC had won the rights to that coverage, but after the American boycott was announced, the network scaled back its coverage considerably. So that's just a little trivia about the media. So that was 1980. We've got an Olympics boycott, which threw a wrench into that event. 1989, we have an infectious disease outbreak. We have measles, which shut down sports for a little bit. Also in 1989, we had an earthquake out in California. 2001, the terrorist attacks, which many of you might not have been born yet at that time. I was 10 years old. So if you have time and if you have ESPN Plus, I really recommend watching the 30 for 30 short first pitch, which is what you see here on the left. I might repurchase ESPN Plus so I can stream it for you all because it's a really powerful documentary short and it is very illuminating in terms of the role of sport in crisis and national disaster. So that was 2001. 2005, we have Hurricane Katrina, which there's a lot about the Superdome and its role in, the Superdome turned into a shelter for people in 2005. And like these events, like we're living through a sports disruption, but these historical events were devastating in their own ways. And 2015, unrest after Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore. So just like we're seeing with a lot of the political unrest around the Capitol, I mean, people are barricading things, they're canceling events, they're shutting down the metro. So these historical events, they all had some sort of impact on sports. And we might not think about that. If you're an athlete or if you're a sports fan, you probably do think about these things. And you think about how we're living through something so historically significant, and we are disappointed that the sports schedule has been disrupted. But at the same time, it's been disrupted because of such tragedy and illness and death and disease, or political attacks, right? It's these things, they affect one another. So none of the wars of the 20th century jolted sports to the core, but the coronavirus has. So that's something that makes COVID-19 significant, is that back last year in March and through like May or June, things were just stopped, right? They were closed down. There was nothing. And now in the past few months, we've had like the NFL and even college football, and there have been adjustments made to the regular sports experience. And we'll talk about the adjustments, but for several months, there were just no sports. So large airports were turned into ghost towns. Theaters felt like haunted houses. So COVID-19 is such a tragic thing that we're living through. And I should have said this right off the bat, but like, if I truly hope that you have not been someone who has experienced loss or sickness with either you or someone that you care about in your family or your friends. I know that COVID-19 has touched way too many people, and too many people have died, and I truly hope that you have not had to experience any of that. And so I should have started with that, because I don't mean to make COVID-19 sound like, oh, like we only care about sports. That's not what I mean to say at all. It's just this tragic world event is something so unique that we are living through, and that your grandkids will ask you about. Like 100% your grandkids are going to ask you about. They'll just ask you about the year 2020, like, to be honest. So that's the point there. So the article that I had you read for this opening week talked about ghost games. And I think there are some really, really moving images of the sports cancellations, or in the case of the ghost games, we've got these games that are going on without fans. And I remember talking to my students last spring about this. I was teaching a sports media class, and there were a lot of student athletes, and they were expressing what the article expressed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, is that sports are not sports without the fans. And going back to our definition of sports from the first part of the lecture, I mean, what do you all think about that? Are sports even sports without fans? So, that can complicate the debate about esports or fantasy sports, but even in the more straightforward, a baseball game falls squarely in the category of sports. Is it a sport without fans? Is it a game without spectators? So that's more of a rhetorical question. If you want to answer in the chat, your thoughts about that, feel free. So again, these images are just so strange, right? They're just, when I look at this, like, it's hard to even describe what it makes me feel. And it's not even necessarily because I feel deeply connected to this baseball player or even baseball, but it's just so weird. It's just so weird, and it's hard to explain. Here's another picture. And so something that you'll be doing this week is, it's called the Pandemic Sports Museum activity. And I want you to think about photos like this that you've seen. And they don't have to be photos of cardboard fans. These are my examples. But there have been a lot of photos out there that are probably going to win Pulitzer Prizes. And I want you to think about something that you would envision going into a museum about COVID-19, a COVID-19 sports museum. And you can think of artifacts too, like things or objects. So what that article is conveying is this idea that live sports have always been an act of social imagination. So this idea that sports are not sports without fans, that's something that we have socially imagined to be true. And even the spectacular notion or the spectacular construction of sports like the Super Bowl or the World Cup or the Olympics, that's a relatively new phenomenon. Like the Olympics in ancient Greece, they had spectators, but some of the events didn't, right? Does that mean that those events didn't happen, that they weren't sports? So this piece about fans and spectacle and experience is something that we have imagined, and imagination is not meant to be like a negative thing at all. Like, this is just something that we culturally have created when we think about a sporting experience or our relationship to sports, our identity as an athlete. These are things that we have socially imagined. It's not just one person's idea. Like, it's not one person thinking that fans make the sporting experience what it is. Like, everybody thinks that. So how did we get to that idea? How did we imagine that? That's some of what we will be exploring throughout the course. And this idea of imagination, though, is really significant because it's inventive, right? It's creative. It's something that human beings have put together to make meaning. So my discussion about what communication is that meaning making. This notion that sports have always been an act of social imagination, that's social meaning making. That is a way of creating an idea together. So, I honestly can't remember why I put this picture in here, the vuvuzelas from the World Cup, but I mean, that was just something that was very, like a memory of those games, of the World Cup, and how everybody, I think the reason I put this in here was that, like, everybody has a vuvuzela, right? It's not just one person. Like, it's probably one of them is loud, but when you put everybody blown into a vuvuzela, like, the footage from those matches was just insane. And we don't have that noise right now. And that's something that article talks about. So I'm pretty sure that was the connection here with noise and sound and how that is part of the imagined experience. So I'm going to show you a video. You may be familiar with this, the Quarantine Olympics, which was on TikTok. This was endlessly entertaining for me. And if you have not seen what this is, this is a 4-minute clip about it. And I want you to think about this in the context of that quote about imagination and social imagination.
TikTok visionary Alex will be competing in the sock slide against three amazing Olympians.
I'm no Olympian, but I've been doing a lot of training myself.
Good evening, I'm Mike Tirico with the 2020 Tokyo Olympics postponed. The U.S. athletes who were going to star this summer, they have been forced to train in quarantine. So, these athletes, along with fans around the country, remain hungry for some type of competition.
Fruit Ninja!
Enter TikTok star Alex Presley and his family, who've been taking on a series of at-home challenges that have been taking the internet by storm. Tonight, Alex will represent Team Presley as he faces off against three Team USA Olympians in our first event, the Sock Slide Challenge. Welcome to the 2020 Quarantine Games. Tonight, TikTok visionary Alex will be competing in the sock slide against three amazing Olympians. Speed skater Brittany Bowe, the Florida native who took home a bronze in Pyeongchang. Diver Steele Johnson, a five-time NCAA champ for Purdue, who earned a silver medal in the 2016 Rio Games. And two-time Olympic gold medalist Michaela Schifrin, an alpine skier who last year broke the record for the most World Cup wins in a single season.
I'm up against some fierce competitors. I'm no Olympian, but I've been doing a lot of training myself. I've been drinking carrots for 4 straight weeks. A 70-30 polyester cotton blend. It is the perfect combination for sliding distance. Been doing these 4 times a day. Help!
It's going to be a fierce matchup tonight. The heat is on and the shoes are off as these athletes prepare for this historic event.
Okay, got this.
Alex is looking very confident in those polyblend socks. I wouldn't mess with Michaela. She's got her game face off. These competitors came to win. They're on their marks. And they're off, just gliding across those floors like human Swiffers. It's hard to tell just who won. It's going to come down to the tail of the tape. First up, let's take a look at Alex. You can tell he was really loving the support of the crowd. He winds up great form, really just flying across the floor, and the Argyle Annihilator comes in at 180 inches, an impressive slide for the non-Olympian. Brittany came in looking very focused. She might have had an advantage with this speed skater form. Here she comes to the start line, and wow, that is one heck of a slide. She clocks in at a solid 184 inches. Skier Michaela had a different approach with the long takeoff. Let's see if it got her the distance she needed to take the lead. It looks like she might have, and yes, it's in at a whopping 191 inches. Can diver Steele Johnson beat that? Looks like he got some great traction on that takeoff, and look at him go. An amazing slide. He almost went straight through the wall. Let's see where this lands him on the leaderboard. 229 inches. Steele takes the gold.
Feet, 1.5 inches, perfect enough to secure the gold medal. Sorry to my other competitors, but this time I won.
What a matchup. What a night. Hope you tune in next week for week 2.
So how many of you saw that on TikTok? Any of you see those videos come across your For You page? And here's another bonus question. Without Googling, does anyone know what state the Alex Presley family is from? The family who started that Quarantine Olympics on TikTok? Type it in the chat. So, again, this idea of imagination comes up. And this quote here, in times of crisis, it's wonderful what the imagination will do. So I don't know about you all, but even just watching that 4-minute clip, it was really entertaining. And I think that clip aired on Peacock or YouTube or whatever over the summer when the Japan Olympics were canceled. So a lot of the elements of like a media coverage of an event were very similar to what we would see in a real sporting competition, but it was the quarantine games and the quarantine Olympics. So just entertaining. What else have you all seen that have helped athletes or fans cope with the loss of live sports? So from last March until now, how have you coped with the loss of live sports? Or how has the new like the ghost games as our alternative, what do you think about that? Do you think there's no point if there's no fans, or do you think that it's better than nothing? And if you don't consider yourself a sports fan, and that's very possible, you might be in this class just because it sounded interesting, that's totally fine. So if you do not consider yourself a sports fan, or like have felt very affected by the absence of live sports, just reflect on what you've noticed about others in your life who are sports fans. Did you notice a lot of your family or friends were like very much against the return to college football or the NFL, or were people in your circle like very much in favor of that and they wanted things to just return? So again, open-ended, just think about it. How have you coped with it? Or do the ghost games make sense? Are they better than nothing? Or do you think there's just no point? All right, so we've made it to the end of the week 1 lecture. So I will say this first lecture had a lot of groundwork to cover, so it may not have been as interactive or interesting as you'd like, and that's totally valid. My hope is that as we keep going, I get better and better at making these positive experiences for you. If you want to fill out the survey, let me know. You don't have to do that this time. You don't have to do it ever, but it's always an option. So for week 1, you will do the Pandemic Sports Museum activity, and you will submit a wrap-up reflection. And that's all I have for you for week 1. I'm really excited to have you all in class with me. Please feel free to reach out, interact with me, come to Zoom, and so that we can get to know each other and have a very positive experience despite being distant and online and virtual. I am always here to guide you through the class.